What I've found with angel investors, and some of them, is that they're more hands-on and they're like, they have networks, they have a lot of expertise, and
The angel.
yeah,
Yep.
the angel. Whereas at least so far with VC, has been more like hands-off.
Okay.
They'll point you know, to
The
someone
right person or
in
something.
in their
yeah.
network.
Welcome back to the Student Founder Podcast, a platform created for student entrepreneurs to come on and talk about their experiences in the startup world. This is a podcast and I guess community that we're building around student entrepreneurship. We like to bring on experts in business, venture capitalists to try and look at the mindset of what it's like working with startups in general, and of course put the student founders and entrepreneurs from universities into the spotlight so they can talk about their experiences in the startup world. I'm your host, Oliver Kukanik, PhD student by day, student founder by night. And this episode is brought to you by a company that I and a group of friends out of the University of Melbourne have actually come to create. It's called Rofi Labs. It's a software development company that help bring startups to life. If this is something you'd be interested in learning more about, visit our website at rofilabs.com.au or hit me up directly on LinkedIn at Oliver Kukanik. Today's episode is a very interesting one. We have the co-founder of a company called Virtetic, an early stage startup which is empowering the prosthetics community through the use of virtual reality. This is achieved by elegantly combining state-of-the-art wearable sensors, VR, and gamified interventions to provide people living with limb loss a fun and interactive rehabilitation method. He has gone through various accelerator programs, published dozens of peer-reviewed articles focused on improving the use of prosthetics, and won awards including first prize for his translational research project at the Australian MedTech 2022 Early Stage Investment Forum. Introducing to you, Ricardo Garcia-Rosas.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
No worries. Thank you so much for coming on to this episode of the podcast. In the beginning phases, when we started the podcast, we kind of lacked the structure that we needed really to, get the most out of the people that we had on. So I like to follow somewhat of a structure in terms of sections, right?
Yep.
The first section is often about being a student founder or a founder of a company in general, right? So I guess first and foremost, for the audiences watching who don't know who you are, let's talk a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Where did you come from? And why are you here?
Yeah, sounds good. So what do I do? So now I'm full-time co-founder, CEO of Virtetic. Been doing that like full-time for a bit over a year, part-time year and a half, 2 years, something like that. I come originally from Mexico, moved here in 2014 to do masters and PhD.
So what did you study when you were in undergrad?
So I did my undergrad in Mexico in mechatronics engineering. I always sort of like the idea of robotics and automation and everything. And yeah, I spent 3 years or so working in industrial automation, particularly in automotive industry. And then that's where I decided to do a bit of a career shift.
Sure. Yeah, interesting. So from your undergraduate degree, you had an interest in mechatronics. You kind of liked the idea of robotics. Eventually, you went on to study a PhD, correct? Yeah. And what was your PhD project focused on?
So my PhD was in prosthetics, particularly looking at algorithms that allow the prosthetic to adjust itself and the way it behaves based on how the person themselves move, and being able to do that while the person is learning. So sort of like shortening the span that you need to find the right setting for the prosthetic for a particular person.
Absolutely. Okay, so it seems then that there's quite a lot of correlation between the, I guess, idea of your PhD and then the actual startup that you've created and now you're working on, right? So proper vertical integration as a true businessman, utilizing your skills in various areas. So tell us a little bit about Virtetic. How did you come up with the idea? Was it during your PhD?
Yeah, so it really started as a side thing during my PhD. When I started designing this VR platform that we're using, I saw it from the point of view of research. So my research itself is not in VR, but prosthetics and human learning. And VR allowed me to test things out quicker and with more people, because you can virtually amputate anyone.
True.
So it set up like a really interesting sort of way to accelerate our research. But where it really took like that sort of like shift from seeing it like, oh, this is a research platform that we can make more like available to other people, to actually looking at a clinical setting, is when I started talking to our clinical advisors, and they tried it out, and then for them it was clear that there was that sort of potential application in the clinic, and
Sure.
that's where we sort of started looking into that.
Of course. So yeah, there's often a lot of companies do that. They go and get the advice from the experts and integrate their knowledge in with, you know, what their traditional skills are. So I have a question, because your company is using, you know, virtual reality to try and improve rehabilitation and prosthetic use. You coming from a mechatronic engineering background, was, I'm assuming, a period of software engineering involved in that degree, right?
Yeah.
Did that help you out with, you know, wanting to go into the darkness and try and you know, I guess integrate some type of VR system for prosthetic users?
Yeah, so I always sort of lean a bit more towards the software side. So a lot of the stuff that I did in uni, like then when I did my master's, I focused a bit more on that side. So like I never thought I would end up doing, like I like games, and I done games for sort of like a hobby on
So like
and off.
game design?
Yeah, like game development. So like
Sure.
when I started learning to program, it was through like the RPG Maker, something like that. And then I never thought I would end up like doing something like this until like in my PhD that I started developing this. Then I thought like, okay, what do I need to use to build this platform and do this research in VR. But I've also always liked sort of the design part of things, like the engineering, that design, and in software development, like sort of got into like understanding how you would design software, and as I was designing this VR platform, even though I could have done it just for my research and not care about it, I wanted to use it also as an exercise for me to learn more about software development and game development.
Sure. Yeah, no, that sounds fantastic. So I want to ask something as well, because you came from, I guess, a more traditional research background and then took a step into, you know, the startup world, as we call it. So, you know, there are similarities in terms of research development in any business, but what was that transition like when you went from, you know, arduous hours in the lab or you know, the engineering office, working on your research project, to now, you know, kind of being more self-driven, self-motivated in curating your own startup and business in a similar field, but you know.
I mean, I don't see it that differently. My PhD was very exploratory, so there wasn't like a lot of precedence like in the lab for what I was working on, particularly in prosthetics. So there, some of the algorithms they were before, but there was a lot of like figuring things out by myself and experimenting and testing things out as we were setting up the project and then developing the research. So I think like the only thing that has changed is that the things that I'm learning are like more wide.
Yeah, more broad.
Like there's so many things that I never thought I would need to learn, and now I'm like learning about like finance and.
So you're not just strictly talking about the engineering side, you're talking about more the business and
exactly.
the accounting side of things as well. Yeah.
And just like leading in general, like a team, and like being responsible for some people.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's a very interesting challenge, and especially when you start thinking like about like money, like in the PhD you don't worry about it because that's your supervisor's problem, like getting the money, but now it's my problem, and that's when it gets a bit like
you gotta write down the finances, make sure you tick all the boxes so you don't run out. That's definitely good insight. So what actually was there like a moment during the PhD that you had maybe like a light bulb moment, as we'd call it, where you converted and were like, okay, nah, I want to commercialize, I want to start something that, you know, we can actually introduce to the community? I
wouldn't say that it's a light bulb moment, but a process. So we started doing the sort of like research commercialization program from Melbourne Uni, TRAM.
Yep.
And they sort of like structure it in a way like really, really good, in a way that you start focusing on the problem. It's like, even though if you have all this research and everything and you've done so many like cool things
without having the clear problem,
like go back to zero, and then if you're thinking that you have that you can solve a problem, go and ask people if they actually have the problem. Since we had that like insight from our clinical advisors before, we knew that they experienced that problem, but we wanted to see how like spread it was and who was feeling that problem. And
so how did you test that?
Just talking to people, like figuring out who are all the stakeholders in the like in prosthetic management and dealing with care with people who pays it and everything. So just talking to as many people about it, and learning about their problems, not asking them like, do you have this problem? You know, being open to listen to their experience
and their insight.
And sort of finding that pattern that everyone sort of had that issue with in the upper limb part, that people spend a lot of time without using the affected limb because they're waiting for a prosthesis, or they cannot wear one because of like they need to heal and everything, like the stump. So so going through that process and like realizing like, oh, it's actually a large amount of time that causes a big pain for the industry.
Not just the person with the prosthetic, but the actual industry. The healthcare workers,
and there's people with like I mean the prosthetic companies. There's like statistics that about like 40% of people end up not using an upper limb prosthetic because it just becomes too frustrating to use or too difficult, or the expectation is wrong in what a prosthetic can actually do. So they have a financial incentive in sort of like, well, how can we help people get trained to use a prosthesis and so on. And they've done things with like screen base and everything, and that's where like talking to people who have lost a limb, like it's really gives you that insight in like why do they not like that. And there's a lot that has to do with like relevance to their daily life, and there are very specific things that you can only get like wearing a prosthesis, and where VR can simulate it to an extent that is actually highly relevant, as opposed to seeing like something on a screen which won't really help them much.
Sure, yeah, it's a bit more practical and hands-on. No, that's really good. So I guess this whole business and such, and the use of VR kind of throws me back to the first time I ever used virtual reality, because I was overseas in an arcade and they had the VR headsets. I put it on and I was thrown away with how immersive like the actual technology was. So that caught me like thinking, surely this technology is going to advance to such an extent, because this was 5 years ago when I first played it, and thought to myself when I saw your company, there has to be heaps of competitors doing something like this, right? So how did you, I guess, view your competitors, and did that almost like at any point were you inundated or overwhelmed by the amount of competition that there was in the field?
We are the only ones doing VR in the prosthetic industry, like that specific application, doing it in like taking it commercially. There's other people who are doing it from research perspective, and like we were doing it. So it's an interesting one, because you have to look at it like, well, these people could like take it and try to commercialize it at any point, and you have to evaluate yourself with that piece of mind. Like, you're not saying like, well, we're the only ones who are commercializing it right now. Sure. Right. So there's all these other people that may want to do it and have similar like research pedigree and everything. But there's and that's where you have to sort of like think like, okay, so what is our value as opposed to what they've been doing so far, and evaluate yourself and how you can be better. Sure. There's also like things that you can do with like that we do is with relationships, with like working with prosthetic manufacturers, because they have that financial incentive. And they have that interest in innovation and so on. It's not their expertise, so bringing people in from the outside to build this type of technologies, you can leverage that from the prosthetic manufacturers, because they're not doing it. Sure. And and then in terms of other companies doing VR for rehabilitation, so that's then I mean, I get access to this, like, can you go outside the prosthetic industry? It's very small, very niche, blah blah blah. But then you have to look at, like, well, what is our value proposition if you were to go to another type of rehabilitation, like general physiotherapy and so on. And that's where I think, like, it's most crowded. And some people are sort of like finding their niche. But, you know, our strategy and ideology is that we design things for a very specific purpose.
So it's a niche enough market where you see there's competitors, but I guess not in the direct field or direct use case.
Yeah.
Right?
So the barriers for them to come to our industry are significant enough to make it difficult.
Yeah, sure.
As it is for us to just, like, you
jump
cannot
into
just
a
say,
different sector.
we want to do stroke rehab now.
Yeah, sure.
We don't know anything about stroke rehab.
Yeah.
We would need to start from scratch, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the actual product, right? I guess in the most simple terms possible, if you could explain how your system actually works.
Yeah.
It's not an easy question.
Yeah. Jesus. Okay. So you need a sensor on your arm to control a prosthesis.
So a piece of hardware.
Yeah, it's a piece of hardware that you would normally use to control a prosthesis. So we use that same sensor to play games in VR that will help people learn to use a prosthesis once you get it.
Yeah, nice. That's good. Simple enough.
How can I make it as simple as possible?
Simple enough in theory.
Yeah.
That's cool. So I guess before we move on to the second section, I was reading a little bit about kind of your, some of the stuff available on LinkedIn and such things. And it said originally when you studied at university, you actually studied Japanese language and culture. Right now, I'm sorry to bring it up because it might be irrelevant, but I'm taking a swing here in that, the Japanese as a culture are quite technologically related, and they have the, I guess, massive niche of anime and things, and integrating technology into storytelling. Did that at all influence your decision to become like a mechanical engineer?
I think so, like, thinking back, because I did it on the side, like learning like Japanese and culture, like when I was like, I think I started in high school. And then did it throughout uni, and I think that, I like science fiction and all the, like, anime and like fantasy and all these sort of things. Like, I guess it to some extent like drove me in that direction, and the idea of like seeing robots everywhere. And, like, you sometimes sort of like fantasize certain things and like the idea of how the world could be, and a lot of that inspiration came from like watching this. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, so I guess there was a bit of a correlation.
I mean, we find inspiration everywhere, and I think that was like the sort of like influence that I had.
Because I mean, your idea, even though it's, let's say, for people who are rehabilitating for prosthetic limbs, I wonder how far that technology can advance, in terms of maybe even helping people who maybe don't have limb loss and maybe just have some type of
limb difference.
Limb difference of some description, So
like we actually work closely with someone who has limb difference, like not had limb loss, and there is that relevance, right? And I guess for people with limb difference, it's also more difficult to like use a prosthesis because they were born with like a different, like a shorter limb or something like that. So they've always had to do things with one hand, and
I guess they don't need the rehabilitation per se.
Yeah. So and then it also becomes like difficult because like there's like the sensory aspect of the for as far as I understand. If it's a shorter limb, you may still have a lot of like the sensory like nerves that would go in the hand, so it's actually very tactile and very sensitive. And people can use it quite a lot to in different ways, but it's still very useful. Whereas when you have an amputation, there may be some damage, right? So the feelings may not be like positive as well. Like it's difficult to tell without like the experience, but yeah. So it's sort of like a different experience and how you can help people in different ways.
Yeah, well, hopefully it all goes well moving forward, and there might be some other user cases.
Yep.
So we'll move on to part 2, section 2, where we talk a little bit more about getting the actual business off the ground, because a lot of people watching, they may have some medtech idea or some startup idea they're trying to get off the ground, but they have no idea where to start, right? And everybody has a unique story when it comes to getting their actual idea off the ground. So after you, I guess, establish the idea and the demand for this product during your research phase, what was the, I guess, proverbial first thing that you did when curating the idea into an actual business?
What was the first thing that I did?
Like, did you write up a business plan? Did you find a team? How did that all?
I started with a team. Yeah, I started with a team because I first did like sort of the workshops to learn a bit more about commercialization, and then as I was going like, okay, because we followed that program, right? Like we were doing that program and looking at what I needed to do throughout the program, I was like, okay, I'm going to need help because I'm going to make the most of it. I'm not going to be able to do everything by myself, and there are some skills that I don't have that other people have.
So how did you go about finding the right team?
I just looked in my network. So two of my co-founders are from the same research lab. One is a mate that I used to run a uni club with, and then the other one is a mate of that mate. So,
So well versed. Everybody knows each other. So
yeah, I mean, in the first business, it's easier if you already know, like, have a working relationship or like know you can work with a number of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So my next question moves on to, so you've got your business kind of coming together, you've got the right people in the team, you're all working on trying to, get it out there. So you've got your R&D side of the business, you've got your financial side of the business and your management side. Now, funding is always a thing that a lot of people think about, right? Because especially for any type of medtech related idea, funding is a massive limitation because they have to prove to some type of venture capitalist or some type of investor that their product is worth pursuing on a profitability scale, right? So what was the first thought that went into your mind when you realized how much something like this would cost, and how did you actually go about acquiring the funding?
We were absolutely naive. As you can imagine, like at the beginning, it's like, oh, we need this amount of money, and like someone was like, because as we were pitching to get into the MedTech accelerator and doing all that, so we were talking to some angels, and we were like, oh, we need that amount, and they're like, oh yeah, sure. Like it was a small amount, right? If you're thinking about software, it doesn't sound like that unreasonable, but when after doing the MedTech accelerator and raising the amount of money that we did like for that program, and we're still like, I wish we had taken more money. Like,
so was it hard to actually raise the capital?
Not that first round. Like we had it easy because we did it through the program, right? So it's basically like if you get into the program, you pitch for the investment, but as long as you don't screw up completely, like you're more likely than not to get
you go through the preparation procedures, right? And then set up a nice pitch. So
the only thing that I would like have pushed for, if I could go back in time, or if I were to do it again, I would have tried to get it both like from the angel investor and the venture capital.
So what do you think the benefit is of going down either one or both at the same time? So what are the benefits of venture capitalists over
they help and invest differently, and what I've found with the angel investors and some of them is that they're more hands-on, and they have networks, they have a lot of expertise. And
the angel,
the angel, whereas at least so far with VC has been more like hands-off.
Okay.
They if you ask for like, hey, I need help with something, they'll point you know, to
To
someone
the right person or
in
something.
their network. But they're not gonna like, let me look at this in
Sure,
detail,
sure.
that sort
So
of
you
thing.
may get an angel
Yeah.
investor who's actually somewhat of a technician themselves. who
Not
have
not
a
so
bit
much,
of
but
insight.
at least that they're willing to look into the detail and then you know, challenge certain things, or you know, comes with a lot with experience and seeing a lot of startups where like
Sure.
people go wrong, or
Yeah.
you know, some things make sense and may not make sense, and I think that's something that we've been sort of missing, like having someone that we've sort of like tried to address it by like doing different programs, like several programs, and having mentors and so on, but having someone who is vested in the company,
Sure.
like and
Yep.
financially motivated,
Yeah.
it's different, right? Because they're
Yeah. It's hard to
take a
find,
different
right?
view.
Yeah. I guess the motivation for someone like you to even start a business is, you know, you're young, you're thirsty, you're hungry for it, right? Someone who has a lot of capital, they may be investing in a company to, you know, flourish their capital or, you know, make more money as such, but they themselves don't have the same incentive or drive to
Yeah.
really get their hands dirty
Yeah.
in the midst of all the activity. So in terms of, you know, the first time you pitched in front of a crowd, was that, I mean, besides the practice ones that you may have done through the, you know, accelerator program at the university, was that in front of people who were potentially investing in your company?
Yeah, so I've the one, because we had different like pitches, and the thing is like we never had to sort of pitch like just out of nowhere, like okay, we got to pitch to, we it was always sort of like through the programs, and
So structured
yeah,
approach.
in a
so
structured way, a lot of
yeah.
feedback. Even if it was with investors, it was with that like feedback mindset.
Sure. And do you think that's just strictly because of the program that you were a part of?
Yeah, like I don't know if actually we did do, so the way that we met this angel investor that we spoke to like at the very beginning, it was through a sort of like a meetup kind of thing that Startup Victoria organized, and somehow we got in, but it was also like that sort of like, here is, you know, a pitch deck and have a chat and get feedback. I think that was like the first one that we did, that we went with that mindset of like we're asking for money, and then we did the one to like the investment committee to get into the program and so on. And I mean I wouldn't say that they're all very different.
Sure.
Like
Sure.
every pitching experience has been a bit different in some way or another.
Yeah.
So
Do you think that, I guess when you were asking for money, originally you said, I wish I asked for more, right? Now, that comes with experience, of course. But what do you think, where do you think not the mistake, but the naivety was in that estimation of how much capital you needed? Was it in the amount of money that is required for staff, or?
yeah, the amount of money that is required for everything. Like I've never run a business. I've never like really known how much it costs to do anything. Like, you know, I take care of my personal finances, and like I know, you know, how much it costs to buy stuff, but
Well, I mean, running a business is a big venture.
it's so different, and it's impressive how quickly you can burn through money.
Yeah.
And being lean, you're like, Jesus, like we're spending all this money.
Yeah. Well, I guess as long as you're slowly making progress, and then
Yeah. I mean, like, of course, like it was just that we had no idea, and no one had questioned it at that point, right? And it's the same. Like we iterate, and now it's like, oh, we asked for this much, and we think on it, and it's like, and we'll add a buffer, and we'll like, you know, make it as big as possible, and we still go out and pitch, and they're like, nah, man, you're gonna need more money.
Yeah, so they know, right?
Yeah,
They know.
I'm like, okay, so how big? Like,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
So, okay, then. So, I guess we've talked about some finances. We've talked about establishing the right team, or you know, how to curate somewhat of a team. I'm curious, in terms of other people that you bring in as advisors for the business. You mentioned that, you know, you yourself as a company you're not developing the actual prosthetic or attachment, right? You're actually working with somewhat of a collaborator, right? So how did that relationship start? How did you reach out to them so that you can use their skills to kind of leverage what your business is aiming at completing or accomplishing?
Yeah, so Rafael, one of our co-founders, he worked for that prosthetic company, So that's how we got in. It was the easiest way to get an
really?
introduction to the market leader in prosthetics, because he worked there and he knows a lot of people, and it was the way to get in. And then the next thing, because they were like, okay, we're interested, let's organize to send you some hardware so you can integrate it, and then we can test out your software. And then nailing that is basically what it's now helping us get into the big leagues with them, because we got the intro, we got everything, like the help and everything, and them seeing the product and being like, oh, we could pretty much put this in the market already, like with obviously some polishing and everything. So that was something that, I mean, I guess we did really well. Like once we had that introduction, that was, lucky, because I mean, like it's the right team, right?
Sure,
it's not that it's lucky.
Yeah.
It's
It was a perfect fit.
Yeah, it's a perfect fit. Like he's worked there, he has that experience, so it's a perfect co-founder for this time.
Sure. And in terms of, I guess, maintaining relationships with people that you're collaborating with, have you had any, I guess, hiccups or things where you wish you had done better in the past?
Yeah, like don't use OSPOS to send something to Europe, because it's going to take like 3 times as long as you hope, and then you need to pay import taxes, and it's never done it before, do it, and
you
it's
gotta
an
learn,
absolute
right?
mess.
You gotta learn.
So there's there's definitely things that like we could have done better, but I think overall it's going in the right direction.
Well, that's good. Okay, so I want to ask a question about how you're actually, not profiting, but how the business needs to have positive turnover in order to keep the business running, right? In terms of who your target audience is, or who's the actual person purchasing this service or this product?
What our products would be, or services there would be covered by disability insurance.
Working through the healthcare system.
So Australia would be something like NDIS or TAC work cover.
And what's that process like? Because I feel like a lot of people, particularly in medtech, getting the government on board or public funding on board for healthcare. How do you actually? Well, good question, because it's very. I like to know. Like it's. It's not simple.
NDIS is very difficult. Like it's. We talked to a bunch of people, and there is no sort of like specific pathway, and I think it's part of in design. It's supposed to be very flexible to be like, what is this? Everyone's different, and they don't want to just prescribe. So it's fairly open, and some of the key things is like, well, there's some limits into what you can reimburse or what you can pay for. It needs to be prescribed or suggested by a clinician or an expert. So I mean, we tick a lot of those boxes. Now the next thing is like, okay, let's try it out, right? Because there's no way to say like, okay, here's a checklist to, can this get reimbursed? Like we haven't found that.
Sure.
With like we had like chats a while back with I think it was like Workcover or TAC, and they basically say like, we need clinical evidence to say like this is going to help people to pay it. And now we're starting conversations again to figure out like what that process may be.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it's one of those that you just need to like keep sort of asking around until you find the right person or something, and it's still something that we're in the process
trying to work
doing.
through it, because it's an iterative thing. All right, so I guess from this point I was kind of curious, once you acquire funding, like you said, you kind of, when you collaborated with the prosthetics company themselves, they said to you, with a little bit of polishing, this may be a product that we can actually launch immediately, right? How did you go about, or how are you thinking of marketing a product like this?
I guess there's like two key things, like two key people that need to know about it. So the clinicians, because they've been the one prescribing it to people, and then patients themselves, but it's not so much as in to sell it to them directly, but as a awareness that this exists and that it has benefits, right? It's not a game. It's an actual medical, well, not device, but an intervention.
Yeah,
digital
to
health
some degree,
intervention.
Yeah.
So how I wouldn't be able to like say like what is the best way to go and market it to clinicians.
Sure.
Like I know that in the industry, so it's just like big like key players, and then there's or like conferences or trade shows, and
yeah, and you can go there and try and spread the word and talk about the new tech.
Yeah, we've done that here, even though we're still not in the market, but sort of like to get the word out. And it's a very small community, so once you start like getting in there, like people know about
word
you.
of mouth as well is quite a strong aspect in a business like this.
In other, like it also in other countries, like one of the other things is that by partnering with a big player in the industry, you sort of like get that access to sort of like their distribution or their clinics or things like that. So at this stage we're looking at something that is more controlled and make sure that business model is new, not completely new, but it's a bit different to what normally gets done in the industry. It's a new technology. There's a lot of variables that we first need to get things right before we go and like say like, okay, here, like, I mean, we have a website, but that's as much as we'll
Sure.
do.
So what's the plans for Virtetic? How long until you actually get on the market and you're released?
Well, our goal is to be in the market in the first half of next year.
Yeah.
So looking at probably the second quarter.
Yeah.
Because here we have a low barrier of entry in terms of regulation. So we want to do like put it in the market as quickly as possible, do pilots and start learning from it as quickly as possible. So then we can go to Europe, which is the bigger market that we're targeting, which also has a higher barrier of entry from a regulatory and reimbursement perspective. So that's the goal, like finish building the product that we're gonna like what requirements that we need to launch and get regulatory approval, and then go nuts.
There you go. That's a great story, and I hope it all works out. Now, final section, it's going to be relatively brief, but I just want to get a bit more of perspective about, your mentality moving into this whole startup game. Running a startup for anyone is an arduous task. You have a high chance of failure. It's like, looking after a child. You have to always be there for it. You have to always make sure that you're feeding the baby and all that other stuff, right? And also taking rests. So how do you manage your time? Like, what are your daily hours like? Things like that.
So I try to be fairly sort of like stay to my work hours and only just work within that time. I tend to do 10 to 6, so I can do a bunch of things in the morning for myself before I get all the interruptions like in the evening. It also like the fact that we're working with a company that it's in Europe. Their morning is our night. So
basically the other way around.
So having the flexibility, like if I need to get in a call with them or something at night, I can do it. But it's also sort of like putting myself first, so then I can like myself and my personal life first, and then being able to do everything else without worrying about like, oh shit, I didn't take my dog out for a walk.
There you go. So the everyday activities, right?
Exactly.
You need the balance, of course, otherwise you're at risk of burnout. Nobody wants that, right?
And when we rest, we like completely like forget about things. But it also it's difficult because I guess like most founders were like very passionate, right? Like everyone's like loves what they're doing, so it's not so much that you burn out because you're working so much, but it's the burnout, I guess, from the stress levels of what you're doing. Because I could be like working on my business and developing the software and the games and everything, and I could do that all the time without like
it's fun for you. It's
caring about it. But when you are like, oh shit, I need to raise money and we're gonna run out of money,
the things you don't want to,
this, like some things went wrong and this and that. Like I guess that's like where it becomes unhealthy because
I guess constantly having to address the elephant in the room, right? Because it's you know that there are things in the business that have to be attended to, but they may not be your favorite, and they're often not your favorite things to attend to.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do it, and like it's still like it's not a problem when, you know, the stakes are not so high, right? Like if you're like, I mean, I'm just taking care of myself, doing, you know, working on my business on my own, like it's fine, right? Like I have savings, I can work on it for a bit longer. But when you have to pay salary for someone, you cannot just do that, right? And that's where it's sort of like the stakes change, and I think that was like the big change for me from sort of like research to like a startup. It's like it's
a lot more responsibility.
Difference, yeah. It's like the responsibility, and you're caring for other people as well, yourself, right?
Of course.
So,
yeah, interesting. So I guess we're almost at the end. So
that's
sorry,
okay.
I'm completely drying out your mouth by talking, but
that's all right.
I was going to ask, kind of like moving into, you know, the startup world and creating this, you know, wonderful product that's going to have so much utility for the community, particularly people who are in, you know, that phase of their life. What are some of the more, you know, bright things in your life that running a startup have allowed you to do? Like what are some of the, I guess, we've kind of spoken a little bit about the challenges, but what are some of the advantages that you've had in your own life of running a startup?
What are the advantages of running or
in your own life? So like, for example, more flexibility, more this or that, right?
Yeah, I mean, flexibility is a good one, but just working on something that like I'm quite passionate about, that, you know, I can, like, every day is like exciting in a way. So it also helps you with, like, at least like in my personal life, it's just like, it's not frustrating, it's not like something difficult. It's something that, you know, I can do like my everyday life and still look forward to doing all these sort of things, rather than I have to do all these things to enjoy my everyday life, but I don't enjoy my everyday life because I'm frustrated about it.
Sure,
so that sort of thing. I think it's just like the fact that I'm working on something that I'm very passionate about, that I put so much time into it, and I'm seeing the benefits of it, like helping people.
Absolutely.
So I think, you know, it just brings joy into the rest of my life.
That's good. Great. All right. So before I wrap up this podcast, I like to do something with all the interviewees that I bring on. And that's just by asking them, what's one piece of advice that you'd like to kind of leave in the archive of this podcast, The Student Founder, for the audiences watching?
So thinking about
one piece
like
of advice
for
students
that
startups.
may be thinking about like doing a startup, what piece of advice? This may sound like a very common piece of advice, but like, go for it. Like, try it out. Like, talk to people and don't be afraid to put your ugly duck out there.
I think people fall into the trap of thinking that
it has to be perfect.
It has to be perfect the first time someone sees it, which is just absolutely not the case, because if it was a perfect duck, as you presented it, it's going to change into a frog. You know, they're going to change it so much over time, and it's going to become something slightly different to what you originally intended.
Yeah, so. and I think that's something that we've done well. We always, like, from the very beginning, it's like, okay, we have something that works. Let's test it out with people, and that has been very helpful, because they tell you what they want and how they want it and everything. And I mean, it's that whole like user experience research mentality. So just, you know,
just get out there, give it a go.
They'll rip it to pieces, but that's the best thing that can happen to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's a great piece of advice. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. We'll wrap up the episode now. And I guess that was that episode of the Student Founder podcast. If you like this episode, make sure to like and subscribe, share it around, follow us on all social media accounts. Links will be in the description. Thanks again to Ricardo for coming on. It was a brilliant podcast. Hopefully the audience learnt a lot. I sure did, about your experiences. We'll put all his, I guess, contact details in the description as well, so you can follow him and his company, Virtetic. I just want to reiterate to everyone that this episode we wouldn't have been able to do this episode without the help of the company that I started, which is Rofi Labs, a software development company that can help you get your MVP and startup in terms of software off the ground today. So if this is something you want to learn more about and how we can help you out in that process, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. Links will be in the description, or visit our website at rofilabs.com.au. Until next time, thank you so much for viewing this episode of the Student Founder podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.